Okay. So Claire Duggan is the co-PI of the Northeastern University STEP project, which is now running on fumes, I understand. Yeah, so it's they're in their no-cost extension. Claire has been very helpful to us over the last couple of years, and especially this year, serving on the advisory committee to help plan this meeting and to help push STEP Central along. So in order to get the advisory committee more involved in some of the meeting activities, I've asked her if she would mind introducing Uri Treisman. So Claire.
So good morning. I had the opportunity to meet Dr. Treisman a couple years ago when he came to Boston to speak to a group of students that were involved, I know I'm short, right, who were involved with our calculus field day competition, kind of a culmination of work of a colleague of mine, Dr. Robert Case, with the students in the city of Boston. In Boston, ironically, over 14 years ago, calculus was only taught in the non-exam schools, and Dr. Case was on a mission to bring calculus to every school in the city of Boston. And I'm happy to say that we actually have our calculus field day again in a couple weeks. So Dr. Treisman, in all of his work, advocates for equity and excellence in education for all children. I saw as he walked around the audience, even before this event was starting this morning, just to get a sense of who is here and the passions that you equally share about children in K-12, community college, and clearly their success in higher education. I'm not going to read all of it. He's currently a professor of mathematics and public affairs at the University of Texas at Austin and director of the Dana Center. He serves on multiple boards, the New Teacher Project, which focuses on education resource strategies, the American Federation of Teachers Innovation Fund, Math Teachers Circle, and the Community College Survey of Student Engagement. He's a senior advisor to the Aspen Institute. He recently served on the 21st Century Commission on the Future of Community Colleges and was named a MacArthur Fellow in 1992 for his work on nurturing minority student achievement. In 2006, he was nominated as Scientist of the Year by the Harvard Foundation for his outstanding contributions to mathematics. He's gained wide acclaim for his research at the University of California, Berkeley, specifically on the factors that support high achievement among students of color in mathematics. How we can enable all students, especially those who are underserved, to achieve post-secondary success is the foundation of all of Dr. Treisman's work. This is the mission that drives the work of the Dana Center. One of his most recent projects is a new pathway project, which he's going to share a little bit more with you, talking about really some of the guiding principles that he hopes will begin to accelerate the transformation that is so critically needed to bring about the kind of success that we need in our community colleges and in higher education. I'm not going to go into detail. Dr. Treisman doesn't have a PowerPoint, so I figured I'd put these things on a slide so that it can be shared with all of you if you would like to follow up with some of his work and the work of the Dana Center. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Treisman.
So when I took calculus in high school, there were 7,000 students in the U.S. who also took it that year. This year, 1/3 of all American high school students who go directly to higher ed have calculus on their high school transcripts. So that's more than 700,000 students. And when you think about what happens to them, 50% of all the students who take calculus in high school. So if you take calculus in high school, yes, there's unevenness in the programs. Some of the courses are weaker than others. But if students are in high school calculus, they're pretty serious students. 50% of them start college in a course they already took in high school. About 1/4 of them are placed into algebra by horrible placement exams. 1/3 of them, criminal enterprise. 1/3 of them never take another math course. And of the remaining 1/6, right. Half, a third, a sixth. Mathematics, right. Lower mathematics, right. About 40% of the sixth who do continue get W's, D's, F's, or I's. You just think of the disconnects. 20 years ago, there were 110,000 students who started their freshman year in college in second semester calculus. Last year, there were only 84,000. And this is not because high school students are getting weaker. It's just fundamental disconnects between K-12 and higher ed. All the evidence is that American public education is getting stronger. Universally, college faculty think it's getting weaker. Right? And the massive number of people who sign up for courses like calculus are invisible in our programs. That's not what I plan to talk about, but what the hell, it was a setup. So first of all, I know I've met about a quarter of you, and it's good to come to these meetings to see a lot of friends. This is Washington, D.C., so I should call you unindicted co-conspirators in the work. We were talking back there with evaluators of this, and so many of you were faculty members or administrators who were the campus advocates for students. People who worked really hard to inspire your students to pursue STEM careers or to create programs that nurtured students. And many of you now are in a position where you're asking, should this be a special program or should this really be institutional practice? Right? And that's the thing I'm going to focus on in this talk, because there is a tectonic plate shift going on. Right, in the United States. 34 states have introduced legislation to change the way public institutions of higher ed are funded. Right? And that funding formula is driven, the new funding formulas are driven strongly toward completion of certificates, licenses, and degrees. So in the past, a lot of the work that NSF has funded, and a lot of the most beautiful work has been funded by NSF, has been often a silo, and when the grant ended, the next grant was sought and a new initiative occurred. There were never any systemic forces on your campuses that caused the president and the governing board to look carefully at what you were doing, despite our best hopes at NSF, and say, how do we take these programs and make them core to institutional practice? So all of a sudden, this is changing. 34 states, it will be in more than 40 states, according to ECS projections, in the next legislative cycle. So why is this tectonic plate shift coming about? Well, there are two reasons. There's an imagined reason. 52% of employers claim that they can't hire people for their jobs, their open job openings. And there's some truth to that, but not a lot. Actually, the problem is low salaries. You know, if there were actually shortages in most areas, Economics 1 tells you wages would go up. In fact, engineering wages are going down, right? With the exception of a small number of areas, like oil field discoveries, right, where there's a short-term mismatch. And in some mid-career STEM fields, where everybody's projection across the political spectrum is we'll need at least 1 million new STEM certificates and degrees in the next decade. Most of it is the fight, the historic fight between industry and education about who should actually pay for the training of workers. That's what it's actually about. And what we're seeing in globalization is two things. Efficiency and productivity increases means there's no one left in companies to do job training or outreach and apprenticeships. And with globalization, fewer and fewer companies feel committed to their local place. So this is not just a US phenomena. The beautiful apprenticeship programs in Denmark, in Germany, and Switzerland are also falling apart because productivity increases mean there's no one who can run those efforts. So part of the pressure to increase our degrees, not necessarily that it's bad, is coming about because of economic forces in industry. But the biggest force in legislation is coming from the fear of downward mobility. That's really the political driver. You all know this is the first generation in which children are expected to do less well than their parents. And Americans, we're a wonderful people, but we do have some character faults. One of our character faults is that we prefer nostalgia to actual history. Right? So we have this mythology that because the founding fathers, people carry the Constitution in their briefcases in Washington, D.C., right, as the protectors of them, somehow they think that democracy will always be here, right, because of the founding fathers in these documents. Actually, democracies are very fragile. Smart policymakers know this. And if people can no longer improve their life through hard work and education, our basic social contract is threatened and undermines democracy. And across the aisle, Republicans and Democrats, in my work in legislatures and with governor's offices, people are truly worried about this, and they know that education is the only remaining route to upward mobility. It used to be government jobs for poor people. They're disappearing really quickly. It used to be the military, especially for people of color, and those military is downsizing. The poor people can't pass the test to get into the military. Small business is under severe constraints and is not hiring. So really, it's us that's the force for upward mobility in society. And how bad is the problem? Intergenerational elasticity of income. Great use of logarithms and differential calculus to understand what that is. But we have actually fallen behind France and Italy in the rate at which you can advance given your parents' income. The idea that we would be behind France, we're just about tied with the UK, with the second or third worst country in the world in terms of income elasticity. That's what's actually driving the policy agenda toward completion. Industry pressures to subsidize their workforce training, which is understandable, and deep structural changes in American life. If too many Americans no longer believe that they have paths upward, we are in trouble. And for upper income people, degrees don't matter so much. Actually, 89% of all people in the top quartile of income earn a BA within 6 years. It's 11% for people in the bottom quartile of income. Right? Just think of that. So this is about low-income people actually having a route up, and if you're poor, a certificate or license or degree profoundly matters to your upward mobility, much more so than for middle and upper income people. So when we hear people arguing about factoring versus completing the square and having deep emotional debates about what should be taught, it's worthwhile to take a breath and step back and remember what we're actually working on, which is the viability and continuation of our democratic traditions and social contract. At least half our energy should be focused on that, rather than whether students should all be able to rationalize binomial surd denominator or do tricky factoring of quartics. So, funding formulas get the attention of administrators. So how is higher ed responding? Then I'm going to shift to talk about my visits to 40 campuses and innovation that I really respect and lessons from it. And then I'm going to talk a little about the need to design at scale rather than designing pilot projects. What I see is the next iteration of your work. So how is universities responding? Universities are old institutions. We have evolved incredibly efficient immunological systems to thwart even the most beneficial of viruses affecting our cores. And how do we do this? Well, you're the president. There's an initiative out here. You serve as the buffer. You create a task force. You create a P20 business council in which each sector hires somebody with little influence in their own sector to meet with the people in the other sectors. I personally think they should all hire out-of-work actors, so at least we'd be contributing to the arts. Then there's an army of 18-year-old, physically well-toned consultants from McKinsey, Bridgespan, BCG, and Parthenon, spouting the language of productivity, which should cause you to run screaming from the room. Very bright young people who could be replaced by a computer program, because they're all given virtually isomorphic advice. This is a symbolic plane of activity. But because it's about money and actually how our institutions are going to be funded, we're seeing real structural change taking place, operational activity, not just symbolic activity, which is designed to protect the core. Right? And you can see this in several ways. Real questions are being asked about the viability of programs, and real questions are being asked about enrollment. And one of the reasons is the first institutions that stood up and actually adopted completion-oriented practices, the Oregon community colleges, the Georgia system, they eliminated late enrollment, mandatory advising, all the things the research shows is necessary, all experienced drops in enrollment because students didn't organize their lives so they could do them. And as soon as they adopted completion-oriented practices, enrollment fell, which threatened their fiscal viability, because their current funding is based mostly on enrollment, not on success. That's what's really getting the attention of presidents. So presidents, for the first time, and their governing boards are asking hard questions. Why aren't students graduating in STEM? Right? We can't just hire people as we used to solve the problem. We have to ask, how are our real institutional resources being deployed? The whole history of minority programs and women's programs and access programs is, well, let's not touch the real departments. Let's hire people around the edges to fix the problem. And that's not working anymore, because we have 40 years of data to show that none of those innovations actually survive, right? They're always funded with soft dollars, which tells you about real institutional commitments. And that is changing because of state policy and national need. So, what else happening on the real level? So for the last 4 years, I've been visiting campuses as part of my work on the redesign of community colleges and access four-year institutions. That means I've spent the first day of a visit teaching in the institution. I've learned that it's impossible to learn what's going on in an institution just by speaking to the president or provost. The first lesson is, every president I've spoken to has a virtually identical description of their institution. This is stunning. So principle one is rhetoric scales faster than practice. They all have learning communities. They all have boot camps. They all have case management. Right? They've all shifted their IR from compliance to improvement. I mean, virtually in 40 case studies, virtually no identifiable differences in the institutional description of a place when described by the president. But when you go in and you teach for a day, so usually I teach like a developmental course, calculus, linear algebra, right? Your cross-section of math courses. It's hard to believe that the places all have the same name of higher ed. In some places, it feels like you're in some Midwestern gas station where students drive up, get filled up, and drive away. Nobody is hanging around. And in other places, it feels like you're in a community center. I was in Indian River in Florida. As soon as I walk on, the gardeners, stop me. Where are you going? Are you a new student here? Me, am I a new student? Right? I mean, it's stunning. Students hanging around. Math departments that have hired students and replaced student support personnel with their own students. I mean, really fundamental differences. So lesson one is that rhetoric doesn't actually reflect practice. Lesson 2 is that pilots do not scale. So I was at a large institution in Ohio, and I had the faculty math department, my kindred spirits. We put a butcher paper around the room, and it's a large department, and we did an exercise. Write down every effort you remember in your career to improve retention in math, recruit students into math, improve performance. 81 different initiatives were remembered. Then we did some descriptive statistics. Turned out the mean length of an initiative was about 3 years. 1.5 faculty were involved. About a quarter of the faculty were, at any time in their career, were involved in an improvement effort. About half the faculty were occasionally involved, and a quarter just sort of did their own thing. So at the end of this, we did the descriptive statistics, and then I asked the question, which of these have replaced institutional practice, had become normative practice? And the answer was 0. So I'm ready for my, Xanax or whatever it is, clinical depression. So I'm being driven by the vice president for academic affairs to the airport after the day. And I said to him, man, wasn't that depressing? And he said, oh, no, Uri, you don't understand. All those grants, they're about faculty development. They're not really about institutional change. But that's in fact the reality, right? They're really seen as ways of mobilizing, supporting, entertaining the faculty who are working with students. Almost no pilot project. There are a handful of exceptions, but almost no